Okay, welcome to the interview with Professor Brian Kemple, and welcome to the International Open Seminar on Semiotics. Whether you are watching us live on YouTube or enjoying the recording, we are delighted to welcome you. This is a preliminary session of the 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 5th anniversary of his passing, in which we'll be interviewing Professor Dr. Brian Kemple. Hopefully, the seminar will prove to constitute a rewarding exchange between semioticians who are engaged in the study of the history of semiotics, as well as in addressing the challenges posed to semiotics in the contemporary landscape. The seminar will run throughout the course of the year 2022 and will feature eminent lecturers from around the world. Attendance will be entirely free of charge. We already have several outstanding academics who have committed to leading a session at the conference and will begin making formal announcements regarding the committee members and other supporting individuals as we get closer to the official event next year. But at this time, we want to express our deepest gratitude to the Board of Institutions who have made this event possible, namely, the Institute for Philosophical Studies of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Coimbra, the Lyceum Institute, the Deely Project, the St. Vincent College, the Iranian Society for Phenomenology at the Iranian Political Science Association, the International Association for Semiotics of Space and Time, the Institute for Scientific Information on Social Science of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Semiotic Society of America, the American Maritain Association, the International Association for Semiotic Studies, and the Mansarda Acesa. Thank you so much for your support. So let's start the interview. I will begin introducing Professor Dr. Brian Kemple. Professor Dr. Brian Kemple holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, where he wrote his dissertation under the inimitable John Deely. As the founder and executive director of the Lyceum Institute, philosophical interests and areas of study include Thomas Aquinas, John Poisson, Charles Sanders Peirce, Martin Heidegger, the history and importance of semiotics, scholasticism, and phenomenology, as well as ancillary interests in the liberal arts, technology, and education as a moral habit. He has published 2 scholarly books. The first one, Ens Primum Cognito in Thomas Aquinas and the Tradition, published by Brill, and The Intersections of Semiotics and Phenomenology, Peirce and Heidegger in Dialogue, as well as a number of scholarly articles, popular articles, and his own Introduction to Philosophical Principles, Logic, Physics, and the Human Person, and the forthcoming book, Linguistic Signification, a classical course in grammar and composition. In addition to being the executive director of the Lyceum Institute, Professor Brian Kemple is the executive editor of Reality, a journal for philosophical discourse. So thank you, Professor Brian Kemple, for accepting our invitation. Thank you for so readily supporting the International Open Seminar on Semiotics. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward very much, rather, to this whole year of studying and learning more about semiotics and talking about it with many great fellows. So,
thank you. So let me say first that this interview and the recording will constitute the reception area for the historical module of the seminar, titled From Early Latin Age to Last Postmodernity, because the seminar has two modules, the systemic module and the historical module, and this interview with Professor Brian Kemple is representing the historical module of the seminar. So, of course, we are here today to address the history of semiotics. Yet, bearing in mind that Deely, like Charles Sanders Peirce, highly appreciated the biographical angle of inquiry, we would first of all ask you, Professor Brian Kemple, about your personal journey prior to arriving here. So please tell us about your school life, what launched you, what moved you into the study of philosophy, and the second part of this first question, where and when did semiotics enter your life, and where and when John Deely entered your life, please.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate, I would say, as a young man. I endlessly bothered my mother for about a year to begin homeschooling because I found the public school system unexciting and inadequate to my interests. And so after much badgering, she finally relented, where given the flexibility that homeschool education affords, I was able to pursue those interests that struck me, including picking up random books off the shelf and reading. And one of those random books was a small Reader's Digest volume of various philosophical authors, including the work of all people, René Descartes, who was technically the first philosopher, I believe, that I really read. And so reading René Descartes and reading in particular his meditations on first philosophy, I was struck by that attempt to really provide a rational argumentation for the existence of God, not knowing, of course, that there was much more historically that had been done and much better done historically in giving such an argument. And so that led me into these further questions about the existence of God and morality and the application of human reasoning to their inquiry and to the pursuit of that inquiry and to searching out answers. And along that journey, I stumbled across Thomas Aquinas's 5 Ways, which even at that point in time were available on the internet. And so reading them, I was struck by my inability really to comprehend them. That he moves through quickly and he gets to these conclusions, and this is what all men call God. And it really struck me as, okay, there's something here, and I'd love to pursue this more. So after a few years of searching out an undergraduate institution for education, I went to Southern Catholic College in Dawsonville, Georgia, where I met many great professors, including Dr. Herbert Hartman, Dr. Cicero Bruce, and Dr. Aaron Urbanzik, who all profoundly informed me in my search for truth. Dr. Hartman being the philosophy professor with whom I took at least 10 courses, I believe, over the course of my undergraduate education, and Dr. Bruce and Dr. Urbanzik being literature professors who were profoundly influential on my search. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that probably the most consistent and enduring support in my study of philosophy has been my mother. So even to this day, she's always encouraging me to continue. So I think what to sort of transition into the second part of this question, how did I get into the scholarly aspects of things in semiotics, and particularly John Deely? In my final year of undergraduate, I was discerning where to go for graduate school, and Herbert Hartman recommended to me that I should go to the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I was talking with him about the various professors there, and he was informing me of what he knew of their strengths and where they would be suitable mentors. And after he's gone through most of the faculty, he says, but I really think, knowing you and knowing what I know of him, if you can get past his attempts to shock you, you will learn the most from John Deely. That John Deely has this expansive knowledge of history. He just kind of seems in a way to know everything about the history of philosophy. And so I took that advice in my pocket when I went down to Houston. And there I took a course with John in the second semester of my first year, his course on human nature. And he did indeed try to shock everyone in the class, as was his personality. And he succeeded with a great many of them. But knowing what the advice that Dr. Hartman gave me, I just sort of let it roll off and went to talk to him a couple of times after class. And we really sort of just had an understanding, I think, very early on about the nature of philosophy and how to pursue its inquiry. So at first, and this is to finally get to the point of semiotics. At first, what really struck me in listening to and talking with John was sometimes the most insightful things he had to say were the offhand comments in class. They weren't what he was teaching that day, but they were asides and remarks that would spark further inquiry and further investigation. And so one day in that human nature course, he said that the only book-length treatise of which he knew that really investigated what Thomas Aquinas means by saying that being is the first object of our intellect was Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. Being in Time is a book that I had struggled with throughout my entire senior year of undergraduate, trying to really untangle its complicated skein of meanings. And it was like a light bulb. It's like, well, that all of a sudden makes a whole lot of sense of things I couldn't comprehend in Heidegger before. And so that led to writing doing an independent study with John on that topic and writing on Heidegger and Aquinas, which led eventually to my dissertation. But in the course of that, you couldn't really have many conversations with John Deely for very long before he would start bringing up semiotics and start bringing up John Punso and start bringing up Charles Peirce. And so that was always in the very least the margins, if not continually pushed towards the center of our conversations, was the importance and the fecundity that semiotics could bring. So that's the short version, I guess.
Oh, thank you. But I want you to develop a little more about the standpoint of John Deely on the history of semiotics. So I'll ask Tim Troutman to, he has a couple of questions related to the 4 ages of understanding and Deely's historiography. So please, Tim Troutman, could you ask?
Sure. All right. I guess you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Let me know if not. So about the 4 ages of understanding, one of John Deely's great works. In the aviso of that book, John writes a witty story about something that happened to him early in the process of writing that very book. And I wanted to read this quote from it and then ask you a question or two about that. Okay, so this is from 4 Ages of Understanding, the aviso. Quote, I came from my Parkview house to the Hispanic gathering in Jackson Park just in time for the food, having been able from the window to see that the time was right. Where have you been? A lady unknown to me asked from across the table, at which I took a seat. Writing a book, I replied, taking my first bite. Oh, queried the stranger, what about? The history of philosophy, I said, taking another bite. Her face took on a quizzical look. What are you thinking? I asked, taking still another bite. Hasn't that already been written? She said. Less a question than a hint. I was wasting my time and, worse, the time of prospective readers who could already find what I had to say written elsewhere and likely better. Not so, I countered, because I have an angle. Close quote. So the question is, what I'd like you to do is, explain to us what is this angle to which Deely is referring. Presumably has something to do with signs and relations, but unpack that a little bit for us if you would. And also, a second part of that question is, why is it worthwhile to have a particular angle dealing with the history of philosophy?
Right. So, first of all, perhaps the angle Deely always had was being just in time for the food, especially if it was bacon. Um, but I think when we're thinking about the history of anything, but perhaps most especially the history of philosophy and the history of semiotics, uh, there's a point. Um, as I've already mentioned, Deely was insightful on Heidegger. He understood Heidegger very well, and he understood Heidegger's philosophy. And one of the points that Heidegger makes in that aforementioned being and time is that the things nearest to us quite often disappear from our understanding of them, that they become almost, as it were, invisible parts of the background or invisible parts of the foreground, as it might be, like the lenses on our face, for those of us who wear glasses, that when they're really good glasses, when they're very comfortable glasses, we don't notice them anymore. They disappear, as it were. And so often, I think the narratives of history miss that which is nearest. And this is how Deely's narrative, his account of history, has this unique angle. For he understands, or what he brings forward in his understanding of intellectual history, is that it's always been about signs, that how we have treated signs or failed to treat of signs has determined our intellectual history from Aristotle up until 2021. It's still that question which is shaping the entirety of our understanding. And so, in particular, I think the reality of the sign and the human awareness thereof is what really shapes any sort of historical account. How are we thinking about how human beings are dealing with that awareness? So when you look in particular, and this is perhaps the most striking point in Deely's history, is that the four ages. You have antiquity, particularly as focused in the Grecian sort of golden age of philosophy of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And then you have this Latin age, so commonly called the medieval, but as Deely would later argue in sort of an expansion of that section of the four ages, medieval philosophy redefined and later reissued as medieval philosophy redefined as the Latin age. This Latin age really does span from Augustine to Ponceau, a later date than most people typically ascribe to it. Ponceau dying in 1644. That whole age was really, in a certain sense, started off by not just Augustine's incorporation and bringing together of Christianity and philosophy, but also his revolutionary insight into the nature of signs as being divided between those which are natural and cultural, yet which are equally and truly signs. And so there's a development that goes through those 12 or so centuries of that thought, and really does culminate in a way with Ponceau, and unfortunately comes to something of an abrupt end thereafter. Not to say that there isn't treatment of signs after Ponceau, but in a way which becomes decreasingly part of the mainstream development of philosophy because of that abrupt switch that comes with René Descartes into modern philosophy, that abrupt departure from the way of signs, which was so characteristic of scholasticism and especially late scholasticism, into this way of ideas. And so understanding that this is the angle which Deely is taking on history, the history of philosophy, I really do think you see the value in it, the value in that insight, and how this history becomes seen in a different way consequent to that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Well, I have one more question about related to the history of philosophy and science, and then I'm going to turn it over and let I think William has some questions along those lines as well. So, but I wanted to ask in the introduction to Yuri Lotman's Culture, Memory, and History, essays in cultural semiotics, when drawing on a parallel between the latter and Friedrich Schlegel, Maritain notes that this is a quote, the historian is a prophet who predicts the past. That is, the gaze of the historian inevitably transforms the past. Close quote. So I wanted to ask, what was or what were Deely's most significant predictions, if we can use that word, about the past, and what is different nowadays in the wake of Deely's diachronic retelling or redefinition of the history of philosophy in this way?
Yeah, so to sort of build off my previous answer, I think the most profound prediction about the past, right, are these consequences of the departure from the way of science to the way of ideas. The way of ideas, not to offend anyone in the audience or anyone watching later who might be a fan or a student of modern philosophy, but on the whole, I think it's sort of an unmitigated disaster in terms of our understanding of what is true. That there's a reason that for hundreds of years, modern philosophy accomplishes really very little, particularly in the so-called field of epistemology. It becomes this sort of quagmire of how do we bridge this chasm between the mind and the world? And we get drawn into ever deepening subjectivisms and relativisms, and along with that, and sort of decreased belief in the possibility of truth, leading to an almost sort of inevitable nihilistic conception of the world, conception of the human person in the world. And so this, gradual devolution of our understanding, despite all the progress which goes along in science, and one could even argue, disputably, but could argue that there's political progress and progress in terms of other aspects of this philosophy, but there's this sort of rotting core at the center of it in terms of our understanding of what is true, without which any of the other progress which is made becomes not really progress at all. You're building up a facade without anything behind it. And so I think that stands as perhaps the one of the most salient insights that he had about that prediction of the past. But I think the other one, and this goes parallel with it, and particularly in terms of where we go from here, where we go really to review, to re-understand, to reinterpret the history of philosophy and how that moves us forward, is this retrieval of scholasticism. And this retrieval of scholasticism not as a mere historical archaeology. We're not simply digging up artifacts of the past, but we're digging up a living truth that's been there all along, one which revivifies our own inquiries, our own philosophical spirit, if you will. And most especially, I think of the Iberian tradition in particular, the focus on Ponceau, but also along with that, the Coimbra and all the discussions going on at Salamanca and all of these other places throughout the Iberian Peninsula that had a real vitality to them in the 17th century, most especially 16th and 17th centuries. And I think this is what allows us to move towards a genuine post-modernity in our philosophy, that there was a continuity from antiquity up until the 17th century that was abruptly and harshly broken by this modern turn. And that having been broken has, it's been a gap, right? So there is a sort of gap in the history of philosophy, in the sense that there's this breakaway from the tradition and this move to the subject. And not to say that, again, good things haven't or won't come out of that. But the genuine postmodern movement has to be one which generally goes beyond modernity. And the way that we get there, as Deely has shown, I think, is by going back to the scholastics and understanding what they understood, and bringing that forward, as did Charles Sanders Peirce. That was, his Deely would always say of Peirce that perhaps the most important thing that he did in his own intellectual history was to ignore the prohibition that Descartes had given against reading the scholastics. And so Peirce, being a bit of a rogue in many ways, was enamored of Duns Scotus, and unbeknownst to him, Thomas von Erfurt, whose Grammatica Speculativa was included among the works of Scotus for a long time, And he read Thomas Aquinas. We know that at some point he had a Summa Theologia in his library, which unfortunately either was sold or burned by his widow to stay warm due to his unfortunate financial circumstances. But he also read the Coimbra. He never quite got to Ponceau, and we can only speculate what would have happened for semiotics had he. But the Coimbra were clearly quite influential on his own thinking and his own approach to semiotics. So that might have been a bit of a rambling deviation from your question, but I really do think that that's yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was great. No, that was great. And I think William has some along these same lines as well.
I want to move to another topic, but related to what you were saying, Professor Brian Kemple, because the understanding of Deely's understanding of the history of philosophy is centered wholly on Western philosophical texts. So if you look at the 4 Ages of Understanding, it's totally focused on the Western philosophical traditions. But what about other traditions, like the Egyptian tradition or the Chinese or Hindu traditions? Do you think we should develop Deely's historiography and integrating those other traditions? What do you think about the role of those other traditions in the contemporary semiotics?
Yeah, I think there's, for one thing, Deely was when asked about this, as I recall, granted it has been quite some years now, and I was not the one who asked the question, so perhaps I wasn't as attentive as I should have been. He didn't claim to know much of those traditions, and there's a certain humility, I think, in not overextending yourself to try and master things that you don't have enough life to master. This life is always too short, and the depth of these other traditions is profound. It'd be quite a tall task, I think, for anyone really to master an understanding of the history of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. But also, and somewhat dovetailed with this, is that Deely had a strong opinion on the notion of what we might call Christian philosophy, which extended to some of his treatment of Eastern philosophy, in particular the Indian tradition, which seems to rely upon a sense of revelation for its principles in carrying out its philosophical understanding. And so you can actually find, I believe it's in a footnote on page 190 of the 4 Ages of Understanding, where he discusses this very briefly. He talks of how, whatever is there to be philosophical is not a matter of East versus West, and that in fact East versus West as a distinction of philosophy is almost incidental, because philosophy by its very nature cannot be sectarian. That any adjective appended to the word philosophy which marks it out apart as belonging to or being the exclusive provenance of one set of people against another is to strip away its character as philosophy. Philosophy being the domain of our common human reasoning faculty, which we all possess alike. And so there's a strong truth to that. Now, that's not to say that we can't talk about philosophy which is done by someone who is Christian or philosophy which is done by someone who is Hindu, and to recognize that those other traditions have an influence on that philosophical thinking. But I do think that there's a strong truth to that point about the sectarianism, that, if we're approaching it with that sectarian mentality, then we can never actually affect a kind of historiographical inquiry into the traditions, whatever adjective we might append to them. So I do think that there's certainly an important point there which needs to be understood. And sort of along with this, people can criticize this magnum opus of Deely's for focusing on the West or focusing on certain thinkers and skipping over others that might be considered important. But, no history of philosophy, no history of anything, I think, can really entirely and truly be seamless. There's always going to be past events, right, which may gain in significance based upon present and future developments in our own understanding. Unless one sort of has an important idea of the importance of signs, for instance, of how central signs are to our understanding of thought, then someone like John Ponceau perhaps diminishes in importance. Right? Unless you have some inkling that signs are very important, you're not going to see John Ponceau as really a very important figure in the history of philosophy. And so there's a kind of a retrieval of the past that goes along that wouldn't have happened in some sense if Deely hadn't been if he had gone to River Forest to study with the Dominicans, and if in the library of the Dominicans at River Forest there hadn't been a copy or several copies of Ponceau's Cursus Philosophicus, and also if Deely hadn't been hounding the librarian to sneak him out one of these copies at a certain point in time, which eventually she did, so that he snuck away with a copy that belongs to the library there. He wouldn't have done the research on it that he did, and he wouldn't have realized this importance. So it's a development happening in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, when Deely is reading this, that brings this new section of the garment of history into focus and allows it to be expanded and developed and shown in its own importance. So I think, just to speak finally to this consideration of Eastern thought, and now my own understanding of Eastern thought, I will readily admit, is very weak. I haven't studied it much myself. I read little bits and pieces here and there, and mostly, to be honest, from a Western perspective. But my suspicion, and this goes to Eastern thought and any other tradition which might be out there, is that if there's to be any sort of open dialogue between the thinkers of the East and the thinkers of the West, that semiotics is the route to effecting it, because there is something truly universal in the human reliance upon and distinctive awareness of signs, which can cross these linguistic and other cultural boundaries which we might have.
Yeah, thank you. Professor, if you allow me, I want to move to another topic related to Deely's historiography, but I want now to go to beyond the field of historiography. So I think we can say that John Deely was both a historian and a semiotician or philosopher. So I think we can say that there is more than one John Deely. But how relevant now is the history of semiotics to the synchronic development of semiotics? So what is Deely's contribution to semiotics beyond the field of historiography? Can you talk about this topic? I want to go beyond the history of we are limited here to the history of semiotics, but now I want to go beyond the field of historiography.
Yeah, and I think Deely would, in fact, I know Deely did not view himself as a historian, and that the work that he was doing in the history of semiotics, and the history of thought, the history of philosophy, was to him this, almost as it were, groundwork for philosophy, properly speaking. That it was how we understand philosophy. It requires an understanding of history. Without that understanding of history, we're not going to know where to go. In fact, in the acknowledgments of my dissertation, the way that I express it is in my gratitude to John was to thank you for teaching me to check my mirrors, but to always keep my eyes on the road ahead. There's this relationship between what we might call the diachronic development of semiotics, or the historical development of semiotics, and the synchronic developments of its the issues with which it deals and the doctrines in which it tries to elaborate. That you can't really have a synchronic development without the diachronic. that unless you understand how the history has moved forward, and unless you really understand the contributions of those historians, or those historical figures rather, you're not going to enter into the conversation. Right? Just because Charles Sanders Peirce and John Deely have passed from this earth doesn't mean that they don't have things to say to us here and now. And that's equally true of John Ponceau and Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and all these other figures who have brought us to this point where we are now. And in fact, I think there's to paraphrase Jesper Hoffmeyer, who's recently passed away as well, every good student of any subject whatsoever needs to revert to the founders and the principles thereof in order to really understand what's going on. And so this, in a way, we can look at Deely through two different lenses, as historian and as semiotician. But I think that's to mistake really the nature of his work, which is to be a semiotician who invariably must, in order to be a good semiotician, also be a historian, right? And so part of this is certainly an inheritance from the scholastic tradition. I presented this when I did that seminar on John Ponceau, that it's a very striking contrast. John Ponceau being a contemporary of René Descartes, the Cursus Philosophicus being written between 1631 and 1634, 1635, and Descartes' Discourse on Method being published in 1637. So, I mean, really just years apart. That Ponceau is in a way a culmination of thousands of years of discussion, of thinking through these issues. Whereas René Descartes is positioning himself as, here I am, René Descartes, hear me roar, or something along those lines, right? He makes no reference to the past. He deals with none of his contemporaries directly in his major published works. He's simply, like pretending like he's Minerva springing from the head of Jupiter fully formed. Whereas this dialectical tradition of the scholastic is, what I'm saying now would not be said without what you had said before. And what you said before would not have been what it is without your forebears saying what they said before. So this dialectical development is germane to any semiotic inquiry, without which I think it's not truly properly understanding what the sign relation is, which is always this continually unfolding, continually developing, continually expanding realization of the truth of our objects of inquiry. And so there is no singular genius of semiotics, which is interesting. Because if you think of even Charles Peirce, right, who is in a way certainly was a genius and singular in his own personality and gifts, but he described himself as a backwoodsman in this field of semiotics. He's just sort of exploring what has become a kind of a new frontier, or was a new frontier in his time. But even he was following certain trail markers left by the Coimbra and by Duns Scotus and others that he read. Even Kant, had insights which Peirce brought into his semiotic inquiries. And so I think in a sense, we should all emulate John Deely in this way. We should all try to be if we're to be semioticians, we have to also be historians. We have to understand the history of semiotics. And that's not to say that that's the only work that John did in this field. Certainly in many of his numerous articles, he gave hints and insights into contributions, thoughts that could be developed and brought forward in many interesting ways. And there is his one book, I would say, that's doctrinally focused in a way that others aren't, which would be The Human Use of Signs, or as it's subtitled and as he wanted it to be titled, Elements of Anthroposemiosis, this idea of how do we as human beings distinctly engage and use signs. Unfortunately, it's an exceptionally dense text. It's perhaps his most condensed and compacted in the paragraphs by which it's outlined and by which it is structured. So it's one that I've puzzled over many a time, and thought that there's very rich fertilizer here which needs to be sort of spread on wider ground to really bring its roots to bear.
Now, thank you, Professor, again. Now I think Tim Troutman has kind of a polemical question, because the division between semiology and semiotics, I asked Tim to ask this question and not me. So please, Tim Troutman.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm the one that gets to be the polemicist here. So yeah, we're switching up gears here, we're talking about maybe etymology. So in the word semiotics, formation and origins, Deely affirms that, and I'm going to quote here, quote, perhaps enough has been said to justify a first shy guess at why, of all the possible names which might be proposed for a doctrine of signs, two in particular, semiotics and semiology, have acquired a dominant acceptance. To begin with, notice that the 19th century authors whose imagination is captured by the possibility of working out a general doctrine of signs unanimously opt for a word that derives from the Greek semion, despite the fact that this word in Greek actually did not mean sign in the sense envisaged by the proponents of a general doctrine of signs. Already, we can detect here a powerful cultural influence of the sort that has come to be called, since Freud and Jung, unconscious. Close quote. All right, now let me unpack the question here. So that's a quote from Deely. So despite the cultural precedent connecting the traditions of sign studies stemming from both the Francophone and Anglophone worlds, namely specifically the use of the common Greek radical semion, Deely is obviously convinced that it was not with the semiology Ferdinand de Saussure, but with the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, that the semiotic age, or as Deely, as you know, like to call it, the age of postmodern philosophy, that age actually dawned. So first, two questions. Unpack that for us a little bit. What can you explain? Why is it with the branch of Charles Sanders Peirce and semiotics rather than Saussure and semiology that Deely believes is where the true semiotic age actually dawned? So the first part, and then the second part, this is more the polemical part. Would you agree that there is a sort of a political climate in the academic environment where semiology is prioritized instead of semiotics?
Yeah, so polemical indeed. And now I'm going to get myself into the polemics here. No, the Caesarean tradition, which really sort of ultimately diverges into Roland Barthes on the one hand and Jacques Derrida on the other, it has a lot of value, I think. Certainly there's many great insights into its focus, which is language, right? I mean, that's where the Caesarean tradition orders itself, is towards the study and the understanding of how language signifies. And so there's the logos, right? Logos in the sense specifically of that spoken, particularly for Saussure, the spoken, but for Barthes and Derrida, the written as well. Human use of language and human structuring of linguistic signification. And, language is, of course, I would say, the most prominent of seemingly explanatory factors in our experience as human beings. We tend not only to communicate with each other primarily through language, formal languages, that is, structured languages. But in our own heads, so to speak, right, we tend to talk to ourselves, right? We tend to explain things to ourselves by the use of language, more so than by the use of images or anything of that nature. And so this sort of explanatory power, I think, helps explain the ease of slipping into this pars pro toto fallacy, as Deely would often call the tendencies of those immersed in this semiological tradition. That is, to mistake this part of sign communication, language, as being explanatory of, or really being the whole of signs, the whole of the realm of signs. That follows whenever the part is so prominent in our experience. If language is at the forefront of our minds at all times, it's easy to mistake that there's a whole greater depth of background of other kinds of signs, which are necessary even, in fact, for language to do what language does. And so this is why Deely believes that it's really the semiotics of Peirce rather than the semiology of Saussure, which leads to the dawning of this semiotic age, as it perhaps will eventually come to be called in later histories of philosophy. And so to advert to why that is, why the semiotics of Peirce has this deeper explanatory reality to it, is that what Peirce saw himself is that there's a real continuity to the universe. Not just our own experience of it as linguistically expressed, but in things which have no language themselves and which present themselves to us without a proper language of their own, even as expressible in language. And so this continuity of experience of the universe, that there's a sort of intelligible cause thereof, that there's something structuring this continuity, which is the sign relation, that if two things come together in any way so as to produce some third, that there's at least a virtual or nascent sign relation there, which we as human beings can understand, and which perhaps even structures the interaction of those things themselves. And so I think this semiotic view of Peirce is certainly something that is lacking when you look at the developments in semiology. And so I don't want to whip the poor boy too much, but Jacques Derrida, when you read his work, there's a way in which nothing is fixed. It's not to say that there aren't continuities or sort of conventions which are lasting in some sense. But the significance of every last word in the Derridean approach to these questions is mutable. It's changeable. There's no really substantial reality, we might say, upon which the truth of our signs, our sign usage, is grounded. But everything is a web or a pattern which might be shifted and altered over time. And so you do find, and this is to perhaps get into the polemics of the question, that there's a great utility of that view for anyone who would deign to engage in a kind of semantic activism, to attempt to use our language not just to reshape how we think of things, but even eventually to reshape the very natures of things themselves, to try and remake the world, as it were, in our own image, which I do think is a lot of what one sees happening today, very sadly, in many different fields of academia. And so a sort of political climate, if you will, there's I wouldn't even call it a radical progressive view or anything like that anymore. I mean, it's a, I don't quite know what the word for it is, but it's a radical attempt to reshape the world. I mean, almost a quasi, deification of human beings perspective, without quite putting it in those words themselves. And against this, the tradition of Peirce really is grounded in that scholasticism, that scholastic tradition, that tradition which is for better or worse, aligned with more conservative or traditional views, religious views in particular. You certainly can't dissociate the work of someone like Thomas Aquinas from his Catholicism, right? However much some people may have tried to do that. And so that's where those views tend to lead, I believe. That when one takes the Peircean view of semiotics, one is at the very least forced to address the question of God and faith and these other things. As Peirce himself addressed late in his own life, the 1908 article on the neglected argument for the reality of God, he says that anyone who really muses upon the relations of the universes and the interactions of signs which occur between them seems to come up sooner or later with the idea that it seems more reasonable that there exists a God than not. As an orderer and a progenitor of this universe in which we live. And so there probably is something a bit political in the tendency towards semiology, as semiology is perhaps very easily used as a tool for one's political agenda in a way in which semiotics is not, as semiotics bounds one to an understanding of the real. It is a realist philosophy through and through, or a realist perspective through and through. In the sense that, as Deely himself said, that he looked at semiotics as beyond realism and idealism, as he includes at the end of Four Ages of Understanding. And on the other hand, he would also say that realism, of course, is true. Right? In this yes or no question of, do we know things that are real? Well, of course, yes, it's true. It's not an ism, though, to adopt in the sense of this is how we structure our philosophical inquiry, because certainly there are things that are unreal, which are also known and which are important for our understanding. So hopefully now I've not alienated too many people from too many universities across the world, but we'll see.
Oh,
that's great.
That's great. Very interesting. Okay, so we have talked a lot about John Deely, but now I want to talk about again about Professor Brian Kemple. So as I said before, Professor Brian Kemple recently published 2 works under leading publishing houses. Namely, Ens Primum Cognitum in Thomas Aquinas and the Tradition, published by Brill, and the intersection of phenomenology and semiotics. So I want to hear you talk about these 2 books, if you want to talk about this.
Yeah. In a way, they're while they're written perhaps in somewhat different styles and without any obvious direct connection between the 2, they really are both on the same theme, and they both did grow out of my relationship with John. Ens Primum Cognitum and Thomas Aquinas in the Tradition was really, it's a lightly edited, modified version of my doctoral dissertation, written and defended at the University of St. Thomas. And it really is sparked out of that earlier mentioned offhand comment that Deely made, that the only book-length treatise that he knew of on what Aquinas means by this being as first known was Heidegger's Being in Time. And in fact, the original outline for the dissertation included Heidegger as a major component. But the best dissertation is the finished dissertation. And so about half that outline ended up getting dropped out of the final draft of the dissertation. But I already had all this material on Heidegger that I had worked on. And I had started talking about these ideas in Heidegger with John. And he had been talking about Peirce and Peirce's notion of firstness. And so that leftover material from the dissertation became sort of the framework out of which I developed the second book on the intersection of semiotics and phenomenology, published with de Gruyter, which, also really sort of addresses this fundamental question, I think, of the unique indeterminacy of human understanding, which is at the groundwork of, I would say, all three philosophers under consideration here, Aquinas, Peirce, and Heidegger, that they are all trying in some way, and all of their philosophy becomes more intelligible when you really recognize what is meant by this being as first known, or this being as the first object of the intellect. Or we might say with Peirce, this distinctive human form of firstness, of the experience of firstness, the category of firstness, which is its own sort of terminological quagmire into which I don't really want to get in an interview like this. But they're all struggling to deal with this indeterminacy, which seems so characteristic of our understanding of our knowledge as human beings, that there's something truly unique about this, first of all, for human beings as distinguished from other animals. And this was one of the insights that I think John had most clearly, and that has been so germane to my own work, is that what do we mean when we say that being is the first object of the intellect? What is that really? It's not a metaphysical being for Aquinas, to be certain. He's not talking about being as the subject matter of metaphysics. Otherwise, we'd all be metaphysicians from, a very, very young age, and clearly we are not. You don't hear a whole lot of toddlers running around talking about, the distinction between existence and essence or anything of that sort, right? Or the transcendentals. But there is something related there, right? That even though we may not be able to articulate exactly what it is that we're grasping when we're talking about being, we recognize an irreducibility of the objects that we encounter to our own world of concerns, to our own pragmatic world of concerns, we might say. Unlike any other animal, the dog might enjoy the sunlight when it goes and basks outside, but it doesn't stop and think about what the sun is in itself. That's something which is a uniquely human capacity. And it's because we have this intellectual insight into that irreducibility of being that it does not reduce to our experience. It encompasses our experience. It encompasses our cognition-dependent objects as well, the things that we make up or fabricate for ourselves, like fictional characters or irrational fears. But it can't reduce to that sort of realm that we create for ourselves. It's always informed by, it's always infused with an awareness of that irreducibility. However much you might find people who wants to act and behave otherwise, right? Who wants to reduce the world to themselves. It's inevitable that someone's going to have to struggle with that question if they're really questioning, if they're really seeking to understand. And in fact, this is part of to relate this back to John for just a moment, of what he, along with Susan Petrelli and Augusta Ponzio, recognized in the mid 2000 aughts, that there's this sort of need to think about what we mean in defining the human being, and why we can define the human being as a semiotic animal. That human beings, unlike any other animals, at the very least, not only make use of signs, but recognize that we make use of signs. And that recognition that we make use of signs goes in concert with that awareness of being, that being as first known. It opens up this realm of semiotic inquiry. And so I think that that's what one finds really going on in Peirce, is that Peirce is dealing with this as well. How is it that we as human beings are aware of signs and aware of the fact that we make use of signs, and how can we distinguish and elaborate and discuss and gain insight through a study thereof, which I think dovetails quite nicely with Heidegger's own concern for the world in which we live. Heidegger is anyone who's read Being and Time will recall, I think quite well, that section where he talks about the different meanings of the word world, how we can use this German word Welt to signify all these different things. And he's drawing upon what has become a common source for semioticians today of Jakob von Uexküll, who coined this term Umwelt, the environing world, the world which surrounds any animal, which is distinct from species to species, as despite having the same things which they objectify, which they make objects of their own semiosis, are nevertheless, those objects are different for them, despite being the same things. There's a way in which they appear differently as objects to them and are treated differently as objects for them. That this is something which is motivating a lot of Heidegger's phenomenology, which I think works quite richly with the Peircean semiotic analysis, which is what I tried to get at in the second book of how they both sort of can help us better understand that distinctive indeterminacy of human cognition.
Oh, yeah, great. So we are coming closer to the end of the interview, but I have one more question. So John Deely has engaged in not just prolix authorial, but also editorial occupations. And I think the same with Professor Brian Kemple, because Professor Brian Kemple is also involved in publishing as the executive editor of Reality, a journal for philosophical discourse. Now, why invest time in producing and editing research, Professor Kemple? Is it an enjoyable task or a necessary pain for the most dynamic members of the community of inquirers?
I mean, I suppose a pain can be enjoyable in a certain way, right? Certainly the process of editing and reviewing and giving feedback is always a bit painful, I think. And I would be a little afraid, in fact, to meet the person who enjoys it. But I do think that it is necessary, and it is pleasurable in a sense to see the good writing produced and the good publication produced. And so Reality, the journal, I should say, it was founded by myself and three colleagues from graduate school, John Boyer, Daniel Wagner, and Franziska Plaza. All of us sort of agreeing that there's something about the nature of academic publishing today which is off. That something has gone wrong in the procedures. For one thing, it's very much a closed sort of club, right? These journals, which are often owned by large publishing houses, are not easy to access for the average person, not only in terms of the actual documents themselves, but also in terms of the writing. There's very much a sort of a specialist talking to specialists in ever narrowing fields, which is antithetical to the very nature of philosophy itself. I think the over-specialization is encouraged by this habit of publishing. And so we wanted to do something different. But we wanted to do something different not only in that regard, we also wanted to do something different in the sense of bringing back a genuine dialogue to philosophical discourse, as we subtitled the journal. Because there's very often the case you have a review system in academic publishing, which is usually done behind closed doors. Aside from the end product, perhaps sent to the author of a submission for a journal, the dialogue doesn't appear to anyone, and that dialogue is often blind as well. So you're being criticized by someone who's reviewing your article, and you don't know who it is, and so you can't respond to them, which seems again really antithetical to the spirit of philosophy, which always needs to be carried on in something of a dialectical fashion. And there always has to be a back and forth and discussion, sort of free and open discussion of ideas. And so that's what we're really striving for with Reality. We're not trying to publish just to publish. We're not trying to have pieces just to have pieces. We're trying to really encourage the best in a philosophical inquiry, in a collaborative philosophical inquiry. And this is also in the spirit of Charles Peirce and Semiotics, I think. Peirce was very much enamored of the idea of a community of inquirers, as he put it, that we're not really going to advance in our thinking as singular sole independent geniuses working in isolation, but we improve by talking to one another, by being engaged in a dialogue, a dialectic, without which we're to lose something, right? So we very much need to pursue that, I think. So that's what reality is after, and that's why we have it. In one way, to invoke a quote of scripture, which Thomas Aquinas himself invoked in his defense of the Dominican lifestyle. If anyone has a problem with this, I welcome his comments, because iron sharpens iron, just as the countenance of one friend helps improve another. And so that sort of dialectic, that open spirit of inquiry, is what I very much like to see come back to the world of philosophy. So there we have it.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's the end of the interview, but let me ask Tim Troutman, do you have any final comments or any final questions? No?
No, just thank you for the time, and I just want to say I'm really looking forward to 2022 and this next open seminar.
Yeah. Before I thank Professor Brian Kemple. Professor, do you have any final comments?
No, I'd just like to sort of reaffirm what Tim just said, that this year promises a whole lot of great insight and great speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to being a part of it. So I want to thank you guys for putting it together and promoting it and asking me to be a part of this wonderful project. So.
Okay, so many thanks to Professor Brian Kemple. Thank you so much for joining us today, for your generosity and willingness to share. Thank you so much. Sorry if I made some mistake. It was a valuable opportunity to hear from Professor Kemple in this preliminary event of the 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 50th anniversary of his passing. So you who are watching this video, stay tuned, because we'll share more updates about the event in the weeks ahead. So thank you.